Welcome back to Latin American Today. I'm Renee. If this is your first time here, pull up a chair. If you came back after the intro, thank you. I wasn't sure anyone would. In the intro, I left you with two questions. They're the questions that started this whole thing. They're the questions I couldn't shake during the silence of the pandemic, when everything I thought was solid stopped being solid. The questions were these. What does it mean to follow Jesus right now? And what does it mean to be Latin American today? This episode lives inside that second question. But I want to be honest with you. I want to be upfront. We're not going to answer it today. I don't think anyone could answer it in one episode. I'm not sure anyone could answer it on a lifetime. What we are going to do, what I want to do with you, is name it. Because the first step to answering who are we is admitting just how complicated that question actually is. So this is where we begin, with the question itself, with the messy, beautiful, tangled fact that a lot of us listening, the answer to where are you from takes more than a sentence. Sometimes more than a paragraph. Sometimes you don't answer at all. You just smile and say, it's a long story. If that's you, this episode is for you. If it's not, stay with me anyway, because what we're going to talk about is bigger than just one community. It's about what happens when a person belongs to more than one place, and what we owe to the places that made us, even the ones we've never seen. So let's get into it. There's a word I want to start with. Diaspora. Now, you've probably heard it. It's a word academics use a lot. It's a word they put in policy papers and demographic studies and university courses. I don't want to use it that way today. I want to talk about what diaspora actually feels like. Because if you've lived it, you know it's not a category. It's not a label on a form. It's a feeling that lives in your body, sometimes for your entire life. Let me try to describe it. Diaspora is the space between where you came from and where you live now. And the trick of it, the cruel little trick that nobody warns you about, is that sometimes you don't fully belong to either one. In Latin America, if you go back, you might be the one who left. Maybe with a hint of resentment. Maybe with a hint of envy. Always with a little bit of distance. Like there's a glass wall between you and the people who stayed. They love you, but they see you a little different now. In Canada, or the United States, or wherever the diaspora has taken you, you're the immigrant, or the Latino, or the Hispanic, whatever box the country has ready for you. Even if you've been there 20 years, longer, even if your kids were born there, you can feel it in the way someone asks, where are you really from? After you've already told them where you lived. So here's the question I sit with, and I want you to sit with it too. Where did you just get to be a person? Not the one who left, not the immigrant, just you. Diaspora life is also a life of code switching. And I don't just mean language, I mean everything. You're one person at work, maybe quieter, more measured, more careful about how loud you laugh. You're a different person at home, while you're Tia's house. When the music goes on and someone says something funny in Spanish, and your whole face changes. You're a different person at church. You're a different person on a video call with your abuela back home, where she's asking why you haven't called more. And you're trying to make your Spanish sound like it used to. It's exhausting, actually, to carry all those versions of yourself, to know which one to bring out at which moment. We don't talk about that exhaustion much, but it's there. There's a grief inside the diaspora life that nobody really names. The funerals you don't get to go to, maybe because you couldn't get the time off. I'll tell you a little bit of my story here. When my father died, I got a call, and traditionally funerals in my home country happened the next day. And so as soon as I got the call, booked a flight and was supposed to get there, but got stuck at the Houston airport. And so I couldn't make it. And nobody waits for you. By the time I got there, it was already over. And these things happened. The quinceañeras you watch on a phone screen, the cousins who grow up without really knowing your face, the way your Spanish, the language your grandmother spoke to you, or maybe Nahuatl or maybe Maya, slowly starts to fade. You reach for a word that isn't there. And something in you panics because you know what's leaving when those words leave. If you felt that, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, and I see it, and you're not alone. But I have to say this, and I mean it. The diaspora is not only loss, it's also a gift. Because when you've lived in two worlds, when you've stood with one foot in each, you can see things that people rooted in only one place can't see. You see how culture is built. You see what travels and what doesn't. You see what's universal in the human experience and what is particular and beautiful and worth protecting. You become, whether you want to or not, a translator between countries, between generations, between worlds. And maybe, this is what I'm slowly coming to believe, maybe that's a calling, not a curse. A calling. And we'll come back to that, but hold on to that thought. Because the rest of this episode is going to ask, what do we do with that calling? What do we make of this in-between lives? So let's keep going. Let's talk about language for a minute. Because you might already be wondering, why is it this podcast in English? And it's a fair question. The short answer is because the people I'm trying to reach speak English. The diaspora's first language is often the language of the place we landed. The Spanish or Nahuatl or Maya or wherever your first language is in our hearts, in our homes, in our prayers. But English is what we speak at work, at school, with our kids, with our friends. For a lot of us in this generation, English is how we think. So if I want to talk to you, I have to talk to you in the language you live in. But I do want to be careful because doing this podcast in English doesn't mean our first language doesn't matter. It matters more than I can put words into it. Spanish is the language that my mother prays in. It's the language of the songs I learned before I knew what they meant. It's the language of jokes that don't quite translate, nicknames, insults, love notes, and lullabies. Spanish carries memories. And then there's the third thing, something that lives in between, Spanglish. I have to defend the Spanglish for a second because for a long time, we were taught it was something to be embarrassed about. Broken Spanish, broken English, like we couldn't get either one right. I don't see it that way anymore. Spanglish is not broken anything. Spanglish is a language, a real one. It's a language of bilingual minds doing the work of being bilingual in real time. It's the language of someone reaching for the most precise word and finding it sometimes in one language and sometimes in another. Sometimes in a phrase that's half and half. It's ours. It belongs to the diaspora. I want to name something else because I know a lot of you carry this. A lot of diaspora kids felt shame about their Spanish or about their English, as sometimes both. There were the kids who were told to speak English at school and then speak Spanish at home, and they felt wrong in both places. There were the kids whose Spanish wasn't good enough for their abuela, whose English had an accent at school, who started to dread family gatherings because someone would tease them about their Spanish, and the next morning at school, someone would tease them about their English. If that was you, I'm sorry. You weren't wrong. The world was wrong about you. There's also something deeper here. Language is inheritance. When we stop speaking the language of our grandparents, something gets lost, not just words, a whole way of seeing the world. Spanish has tú and usted, formality and warmth, baked right into how you address someone. The Spanish has whole phrases, que Dios te bendiga, mi vida, que en paz descanse, that don't translate cleanly because they carry a worldview, not just a sentence. When you lose a language, you lose a window into the world. But here's the good news. You can also reclaim it. You can sit with your kids and teach them a word. You can put on the music. You can call your mom and ask her to tell you the story again, but this time in Spanish. Reclaiming language is sacred work. It's small, it's slow, it's worth it. And for those of us who do these podcasts in English, we don't do it in opposition to our original language. And whether it be Spanish, Nahuatl, Maya, we do it because the diaspora needs to hear itself talked about in its own language too. This is one of the languages of the diaspora. So this is one of the languages we get to use. Now, we have to talk about something a little uncomfortable. I told you in the intro that some episodes may want you to throw your phone across the room. This might be one of them. It really might want to make you throw your phone across the room. But we need to talk about Latinidad. Latinidad, for those who haven't heard the word, is the idea of a shared Latin American identity. A common cultural ground that all Latin Americans, no matter where they're from, are supposed to recognize and belong to. And on the surface, it sounds beautiful. A community of communities, to say. A bridge across countries. But here's the thing. Most of what gets sold to us as Latinidad isn't the whole community. It's a marketing category. Let me explain what I mean. When you turn on the television, when you walk through the supermarket, when a brand wants to sell you something at the Latino market, what do they show you? A telenovela aesthetic, salsa music, a certain brand of beans, a particular kind of body, a particular kind of face, a particular kind of accent. Now, those things are real. They're a real part of culture. I mean, I love a good novela. I love salsa. I'm not throwing any of that out. But that picture isn't all of us. There's a scholar I mentioned in the intro, Arlene Davila. She spent years researching how Latin American identity gets packed for mass markets. And her argument is sharp. She says that when Latinidad gets packed for big brands and big budgets, the communities that get centered are usually the lighter skinned ones, more European presenting, more easily palatable versions of us. The rest of us get edited out. And that's a hard sentence. Let me say it again. The rest of us get edited out. So who's edited out? Afro-Latinos, Black communities across the Caribbean and the continent who have been Latin American for centuries and who barely appear in brand campaigns. Indigenous peoples, the original peoples of the land, Quechua speakers, Aymara speakers, Mapuche, Nahua, Garifuna, Maya, working class communities, rural communities, communities that don't have the export aesthetic. Latin America is one of the most racially, linguistically, culturally diverse regions on Earth. And we let the market sell us a single image of ourselves. That's not unity. That's flattening. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying we shouldn't have a shared identity. We can, and we do. There's something real in the way Latin Americans across borders recognize each other's. What I'm saying is, we have to be honest about who got left out of the picture. We have to ask, when someone says Latino, who do they actually mean? Who's invisible? And whose culture is being used as the universal stand-in? This isn't about cancellation. This is about expansion. Expanding Latinidad to actually mean what it always should have meant. All of us. Every shade, every language, every history, every story. That's a project, I think. That's what it would mean to take this identity seriously. I want to say one more thing here because it's personal. When I started asking these questions about who gets centered, who gets edited out, what kind of Latin American I'm allowed to be, I started looking at my own family. I started asking what I'd been taught about my own ancestry and what had been quietly left unsaid. And what I found was complicated. And I'll share more of that journey as this podcast goes on. But I want you to know, I'm not asking these questions from some clean, comfortable distance. I'm asking them because they show up at my own kitchen table. And I'm pretty sure they've shown up at yours too. So sit with this one. The version of Latinidad that sells products is not the same as the version that includes everyone it claims to include. And we can do better than that. We can do better than what the marketplace has handed us. And this is the part of the episode that matters most to me. And I've been building up to it. Because everything before this, the diaspora, the language, the critique of Latinidad, it all leads here. To a question I think we have to ask if we're going to talk seriously about who we are. What about our pueblos originarios? For those who haven't heard the term, pueblos originarios are the original nations of Latin America, the peoples who lived on this land, in these territories since time immemorial, thousands of years before colonization. The Mapuche, the Nahua, the Aymara, the Quechua, the Garifuna, the Maya, the Taíno. There are hundreds of them, hundreds. They're not a footnote in our history. They are the foundation of it. But here's the truth that a lot of us were raised inside. Most Latin Americans, most of us, have indigenous ancestry. It's in our DNA. It's in our faces. It's in the food we cook. The words we don't realize are indigenous loan words. The spiritual practices our grandmothers performed without naming what they were. And many of us were raised to minimize it or to ignore it altogether. We're Spanish, we're told. We're mestizo, but we're really more Spanish than anything. We don't really know that side of the family. Now, these aren't just casual statements. They're a way of stepping away from a part of ourselves. They're inheritance from a system, colonialism, that taught our great-great-grandparents that being closer to European was being closer to civilized. That being indigenous was being less. And that's a lie. It always was. And we're still paying the cost of that lie. Now, I told you this podcast is rooted in faith. And here's where I have to come back to it. There's a verse in Acts, chapter 7, verse 26. Paul is talking to the Athenians in the middle of an empire about who God is. And he says, God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Every nation. Every nation. That includes the Mapuche. That includes the Quechua. That includes the Nahua. That includes the Aymara. That includes the Garifuna and the Maya and the Taíno. And every people the marketplace would prefer we forget. They are not a footnote. They are the nations made by God. Colonialism didn't just take the land. We don't say this enough. Colonialism took names. It took languages. It took entire spiritual worlds. It told the peoples who already live here that their gods were demons, that their songs were sin, that their very existence was something God needed to wipe out. That was not God's voice. That was empire's voice, wrapped in God's name. We have to be able to tell the difference. And as Christians in the diaspora, I think part of our work is learning to. So what does it look like to honor pueblos originarios in the diaspora? Not as a museum exhibit, not as a performance, not as a costume in a school presentation, but as living communities, as relatives, as part of who we are. It looks like learning. It looks like asking, do I know what indigenous peoples are originally from where my family comes from? Most of us don't. I didn't. I had to look it up. It looks like supporting indigenous-led organizations, listening to indigenous Latin American voices, local indigenous people, local First Nations peoples, reading their writers, their thinkers, their theologians. It looks like at the kitchen table, refusing to let our families repeat the lie. Gently, patiently, but refusing. I want to say something to anyone listening who's farther along this road than I am. Anyone whose indigenous identity is something they grew up knowing and naming and walking in. I'm sorry for every version of Latinidad that erased you. I'm trying. We're trying. Don't give up on us. And to anyone listening who's just starting to ask these questions, like I'm just starting, welcome. Take it slow. Take it seriously. Don't perform it. Live into it. This is who we are, all of us, every chapter. Not just the one the world wanted to keep. Okay, that was a lot. It's a lot for me too. So let's bring it home. I want to bring it back to Jesus. Not as a conclusion, like we've talked about all these complicated stuff and now I'm going to wrap it up in a Bible verse. It's not what I want to do. I want to bring it back to Jesus because I think faith, actually lived honest faith, is the lifeline that the in-between life needs. Here's something I've been thinking about a lot. The Bible is full of diaspora people. Abraham left his homeland. He didn't even know where he was going. Hebrews chapter 11 says he obeyed and went out, not knowing where he was going. That sentence describes more diaspora people than I can count. It definitely describes me. Joseph was sold into slavery in a foreign country. He had to figure out who he was in Egypt, surrounded by a language that wasn't his, by gods that weren't his, by a culture that didn't share his story. And God is still moved through him in there. Ruth followed Naomi into a land that wasn't hers. She didn't even know if she'd be welcome. And she said the most diaspora sentence in scripture. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Daniel served in a government that didn't share his values. He kept his faith in a place that didn't recognize it. Jesus himself, Jesus, was a refugee as a child. His parents fled to Egypt to keep him alive. His family knew the diaspora life from the very beginning of his life on earth. If you've ever felt like your faith and your in-betweenness were somehow incompatible, please hear me on this. Your story is the Bible story. Here's what I think this means, and I'm still figuring out, so I'm hoping you receive this gently. God doesn't ask us to resolve the tension of the diaspora before he shows up. He doesn't say, figure out where you're really from, then I'll meet you there. He shows up in the middle of the in-between. He shows up in the wondering. That's actually where most of the meaningful encounters happen in Scripture. In the wilderness, on the road, in the foreign country. At the well in the middle of nowhere, between cities, between identities. If you feel like you're between things right now, that may be exactly where God is going to find you. Following Jesus in the diaspora, at least the way I'm starting to understand it, means carrying your whole self into your faith, your culture, your history, your language, your music, your questions, your accent, your grief, your particular and complicated story. You don't check those at the door of the church. They come with you because you come with you. I'll be honest with you. The church in Canada, and I imagine it's true in the United States and other places where the diaspora has landed, sometimes asks Latin Americans to assimilate the spirituality the way the broader culture asks us to assimilate socially. You can feel like, hey, leave your accent at the door, leave your worship style at the door, leave your particular questions at the door. We'll give you Jesus, but in the version that's already been packed for someone else. I want this podcast to push back on that, gently but firmly, because we don't need a version of Jesus that's been edited down to fit someone else's culture. Jesus already speaks our languages. Jesus already knows our songs. Jesus already knows our people. Jesus already meets us in the middle of all the things we're carrying. So let me ask you these questions. And these are real questions, not rhetorical ones. What does worship sound like in your own voice? Not the voice you put on at church, but your actual voice. What does prayer sound like in your language, in your full language? With the Spanish in there, with Spanglish in there, with silence in there when there are no words. What does the gospel look like when it's planted in your community? Not transplanted, planted, rooted in your soil. I don't need answers to those questions, but I have a hunch. The hunch is this: when we stop trying to make our faith fit someone else's culture and start letting our faith grow up out of who we actually are, God meets us differently, more deeply, with more truth. That's the kind of faith I want. That's the kind of faith I think the diaspora is hungry for. So let's close. We've covered a lot today. We've talked about the diaspora, what it actually feels like to live in between two places. We talked about language and the way it carries memory and identity. We talked about Latinidad, who gets center and who gets erased. We talked about pueblos originarios, the original nations whose stories we're still learning to honor. And we talked about faith as a lifeline for in-between people. I told you at the beginning, we weren't going to answer the questions. Who are we today? We were just going to name it, sit with it, let it open. I think we did that. But I also want to give you something to take with you, because this isn't just my conversation. I want it to be ours. Here's what I want you to do this week. Just 3 small things. 1, think about an ancestor whose story you don't know. And ask someone who might. Call your mom, call your tia. Ask the question. Even if the answer is, I don't know either. It's the asking that matters. 2, pick one piece of your heritage you've been disconnected from. A word, a recipe, a song, a prayer. Just one, and reconnect this week. 3, sit with one question about your identity that you've been afraid to ask. Just sit with it. You don't have to answer it yet. Just stop running from it. And then tell me. Find me on social media, Latin American Today on Instagram. Send me a message. Tell me where you're from. Tell me what your diaspora feels like. Tell me what part of this episode hit you and what part made you want to throw your phone. I want to hear it. I really do. This podcast doesn't work without you. Next time on Latin American Today, we're going to go further back. We're going to talk about what it means to actually go looking for the parts of yourself that were edited out. We'll talk about ancestry. We'll talk about names. We'll talk about the stories that get passed down and the ones that get buried. You don't want to miss it. Until then, we don't have to choose between where we come from and where we are. We get to carry both. That's the gift. That's the weight. That's Latin American Today. You're not in between two worlds. You are the bridge. Hasta la próxima.